today we're going to be talking about multi-level governance. So let's just get right to it. So essentially, multi-level governance refers to how we organize different governments according to different levels. So generally, I put kind of this pyramid up here. In most countries or most places, you'll be organized according to 3 or 4 different levels. But again, this is going to vary by every country. There's usually a local or municipal at the lowest level, some sort of a state, provincial, or regional government, a national, central, or federal government. They all have different names. And then in some cases, even supranational national governments. So the case could be, for example, the EU is a supranational, meaning it composes a variety of countries together in one government. But we'll talk more about each of these different levels. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the different levels we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about how they relate to each other and what some of the major issues are in designing government when we're talking about multi-level governance. So here's just an example to give you a sense of what multi-level governance look like in practice. So at the smallest level, in Germany, for example, there are boroughs, for example, in the city of Berlin. So one example would be the small little borough of Wilhelmsdorf-Charlottenburg. My German's not great. So somebody living there is living in a specific borough. Now they're living in a specific city, which also in this case happens to be a Länder or a state of Berlin. And now that state is nested into Germany, the country, and then Germany, of course, is within the European Union, which is a supranational government. So we like to think of it kind of like Russian dolls, where different levels are nested within other levels, and each level has specific powers, but where they get those powers might be different. Who can override those powers are going to be different. What those powers are going to be different. And so that's the main thrust of multi-level governance and why it's such an interesting topic in comparative politics, because every country does it differently. So let's start off then with the highest level, so supranational or international government. So government at the international level is generally a matter of countries being willing to work with each other to deal with issues that go beyond boundaries. So things like global security, climate change, global economic issues, those all go beyond just the boundaries of countries, and so countries have to work together in order to solve these problems. So, for example, the UN was established in part to promote world peace, development, and human rights. The example of NATO was developed for joint security, the International Monetary Fund for global monetary cooperation to secure financial stability in the world. So these sorts of organizations exist, and governments decide, we're going to work together, we're going to cooperate. So most of these organizations are called confederations, meaning that they're going to cooperate with each other, but they retain their national sovereignty. So just because we are part of the UN doesn't mean the UN can legislate and tell us exactly what to do within our country. It's always up to us in Canada whether we want to actually implement suggestions by the UN, for example. Now, supranational government goes one step further in that they pool sovereignty and engage in joint decision making. So the example of this being the EU, and we're going to look more at the EU in just a minute, or a few seconds actually. But the European Union is an example where countries actually do give up some sovereignty. They do give up movement of people between borders, some common currency. So they are giving up some of their sovereignty, and in exchange they are involved in joint decision making through a joint supranational government. So rather than explaining to you the EU, I'm going to send you over to CGP Grey, one of my favorite YouTubers, who's going to explain all of the complicated aspects of the EU. This will be on the quiz. There'll be a kind of a little question from there. So please go watch that now. So pause the video, go watch, and come back. Welcome back. So the next 2 levels I've put together because the distinction between national and subnational governments is very difficult. It's going to look different in every country. So obviously national government meaning the country level government, subnational meaning state, provincial, any sort of subnational government that exists. So the key thing we need to think about here is the difference between federal and unitary states. So unitary governments are those that have only one level of government, or only one level of government that has its own autonomous constitutional powers. So in some cases of unitary government, there is only one national government and they make all the political decisions. In other cases, the state, province, or local governments might exist, but these regional levels have no constitutional autonomy and they're dominated by the national government. So in this case, while there might be subnational units and subnational governments, they only derive their power from the national government. So the national government can give and take away at their whim, essentially. Actually, a lot of countries in the world have unitary governments. The United Kingdom is technically still a unitary government. France, Italy, Japan, Singapore, South Korea. So there's many countries in the world that have unitary governments. So now we know from what we know about Canada that federal government means the opposite, in the sense that there are subnational units that have constitutionally derived powers, meaning that the federal government or the national government cannot take away the powers that are invested in these subnational units. So they have specific areas of jurisdiction. So we know from Canada, for example, healthcare and education are the purview of provincial governments, and the federal government can't really walk on those areas of jurisdiction without having some constitutional issues on their hands. So the question then is, well, what are the benefits and detriments of having a federal versus a unitary state? So here's some of the benefits. One of the most cited benefits of federalism is that it's an additional check on government power. So in a unitary state, government power is going to be really centralized, whereas in a federal state, power can be dispersed between a variety of different levels of government. And so the more different places and people with power, the more likely that absolute power will get checked. So it makes it difficult for one set of political elites to control all of government, to control all of power. So the different levels can act as a check on each other. So for example, in Canada, we know that provincial premiers can often be quite a thorn in the side of the federal government, and really stand up for their provinces and provide a check on prime ministerial power, for example. Another benefit is that federalism can protect local or regional interests. So especially in modern nation states that are super large and have really diverse populations, Canada, again, is a great example of this, certain groups are going to have different needs, especially different regions will have different needs, especially if there's a particular ethnic or religious or linguistic group in a larger nation. And so federalism can help geographically based minorities from not having to be entirely at the mercy of a unitary government or a national government that might not, be representative, might not really know how to best support them. And then also dealing with these large geographic areas, again, in the case of Canada is a good example, it's very hard to administrate such a huge geographic area through one unitary government, especially in the past when there was issues of communication and transportation that meant that it was going to take a while for you to get information from Ottawa to BC. Less of an issue today because we have technologies that can help us to effectively administrate large geographic areas, but still, if you look at a country as large as Canada, it's really hard to administrate from one city in the middle, or in the east, all of the provinces and all of everything that's going on. So federalism can help you kind of break it down into smaller geographic regions so that you can actually govern better. There are, of course, though, weaknesses of federalism. The two major ones, first of all, is that it can make it very difficult to get things done. And you can see this in Canada with current issues with, carbon pricing, for example. That trying to get all the provinces on board is very difficult. And so it can really just lead to paralysis of government, where government just can't get stuff done, especially when it comes to large issues, climate change being a great example. It doesn't really stop at provincial borders, but because of the provinces, it's quite difficult to come to an agreement altogether of how we're going to go about dealing with this challenge. It can also reinforce and entrench certain divisions in a country and actually contribute to political instability. So, again, Canada provides a good example in the sense that Quebec nationalism, for example, one could question, would that be so strong if Quebec wasn't its own province. I mean, some would also say that that's what kept Canada together, is the fact that Quebec had some sovereignty. That's a loaded word, but some local control, provincial control. But this question of, it can actually reinforce divisions and break countries up. And you can see that in lots of separatist movements. There's one more thing I wanted to mention, and this will be the interesting case of the day, is for national and subnational governments, is quasi-federalism. So this UK is a good example of this idea that there's some degree of home rule, but that the central and local governments depend on each other. So there's lots of cases, and the UK is the best case. I shouldn't have said lots of cases. There are cases. The UK is a good case of that, where there is movement towards decentralization and movement towards creating some sense of something that looks like federalism in an actually unitary state. And this is, of course, where we get the devolution debate. So here's a kind of really quick summary video about the issue of devolution and independence in the UK, and particularly this issue of Scottish independence. And it really demonstrates to us that federalism or unitary government is not necessarily static, and that it's not always one or the other, that sometimes you can have components of each within a government, within a country. So go pause this video, take a look at this particular case. Again, it will be on the quiz, so take a quick look and come back. And hopefully you're back now. So the last level that we talked about was local government. So this could be local government, municipal government, county government, and it really just allows for the governance of a smaller geographic area. I like to give the example that you don't want the federal government to fix your potholes. It's hard enough to get potholes fixed in a city where you can actually kind of like go to the city hall and actually talk to the councillor. But imagine if the federal government of Canada was trying to fix potholes in every country, in every city. That would be, there would be no potholes fixed. So it's just a matter of allowing for local provision of services, allowing for local innovation, and because really, honestly, things like sewage and potholes and school zonings, there are things that are just better suited to local knowledge, and therefore to local government. So there's a few different categories of local government, especially in unitary states. So just an aside, if you're interested for Canada, so our local governments derive their powers entirely from provincial governments. So they are not constitutionally prescribed. So it's kind of like within each province, it's kind of like a unitary government in the case that a province could take away or give any sort of powers that they want to the municipalities. It's completely under the jurisdiction of the provinces. But in a unitary state, there's kind of three different categories of local government that we might get. So the first is a fused system, where agents of the central government are supervising local government to ensure that things are being run as the central government would like. We say Napoleon Bonaparte liked to do that. So very much lots of national control over local government. A dual system is where local government is managed at arm's length from the central government. So it has its own organizations and its own set of administrators. So one example I'd like to give, because I study election administration, is UK election administration. So each elections are run by each local administrator in the UK, but there are some common standards that are provided by the central government. So you obviously can't just go and do whatever you want. There are certain standards and guidelines for how you run an election, but at the end of the day, the actual nuts and bolts of running an election are done at the local level. So that's an example of a dual system. And then obviously local self-government is exactly what it sounds like, freedom for local action, and just very much giving lots of local freedom to innovate and to have freedom to do whatever sorts of governance they would like. So very self-explanatory there. So talking about freedom to innovate and such, this is actually a domestic example from this city of Innisfil. So it's a little TED Talk. It is a bit long, but worth getting through some of it at least. Actually, no, get through the whole thing. It's a good TED Talk. It essentially explains a local example of how innovation can be fueled through decentralizing government. And we're going to talk a lot about some of these issues in a second. So pause this video, go take a look at this TED Talk about Innisfil, come back. Welcome back. So the next thing I want to talk about today is changes and innovation in multi-level governance. And so oftentimes we think of Canada as an example, and we say, well, Canada is a federal system. It's always been a federal system. It always works this way. But there's actually a lot of moving pieces. Multi-level governance is not something that stays static. And so here are some of the kind of movements or changes, patterns of changes within multi-level governance in recent years. So the first of these is consolidation. So in a lot of countries, smaller units of local government have gotten amalgamated and consolidated into larger units. It can be done either voluntarily or you can be forced to do it. One example of this, we could see the Greater Toronto Area. So a lot of different Toronto municipalities getting merged together so that they can actually administer services maybe a little bit more effectively. That's questionable, but regardless, the point being that you can see this consolidation of smaller areas in order that they can be more efficient. Same example being in Montreal, except that certain areas in Montreal decided not to become part of it, but we can talk about Westmount later. Essentially, this idea of consolidation has been a movement within multi-level governance that we can see lots of examples of. Largely the idea for efficiency. Why are we hiring 5 different snowplow companies when we can just hire one to do the entire city and become a larger, like the GTA, a larger area. The next one is the growth of meso-government. So this is kind of the middle level of regional government, kind of fits between central and local government. So for example, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, even the directly elected mayor of London. So these are all things that are not constitutionally prescribed, but again, you see this development of a middle level of government where there wasn't one before. And once again, what we saw in the UK is a good example of very much a growth of meso-government. The third one is a movement towards decentralization in unitary states. So the idea that more power is given to local governments, often in response to economic problems. So the idea is that the unitary government or federal government can't really afford to pay for a certain service, so they say, actually, we're gonna give you more power. Your local government, you can handle this issue, and in return, you get this decentralization occurring largely out of financial necessity because the unitary government or the central government just can't afford to do it. So especially in issues in times of economic crisis, decentralization is a great way to save some money because it's somebody else's problem. And the last one is the opposite, obviously, centralization in federal states. And so this is exactly what it sounds like, where federal governments want to increase their power, where maybe they've been set up in a way that gave more power to provinces or states. Canada is a great example. Things like healthcare and education are all the purview of provincial governments, but the federal government kind of wants their hands in that pot. I think that's a metaphor, but wants to take some role in these sorts of big issues that Canadians care about, especially during elections. Being able to talk about increasing funding for healthcare is generally good at the ballot box. So one of the ways that Canada did this, for example, the Canadian federal government got their hands into a provincial jurisdiction is, for example, the Canada Health Act, the idea that we want to have uniform health standards across, or healthcare delivery standards across Canada. And so the way we're going to actually get ourselves into this issue, even though we have no constitutional jurisdiction, is by saying, well, we're willing to fund some things if you do what we ask you to do. So federal government will say, we will transfer this money to you if you do X, Y, Z. And this is one way that a federal government is able to increase some control because obviously very few people or very few provinces are going to say, nah, we don't want your money. Generally, money is a good thing. So those are some of the movements that you can see happening within multi-level governance. So it's not like you just kind of design your government and then it's static. There's lots of movement and shifts and changes in multi-level governance around the world. So the big question, though, that remains is which is better, to be super centralized or to be super decentralized? Obviously, we learned in designing government that it really depends on the country. Of course, there's not one universal form of government that's going to work for everybody. But let's go through some of the pros and cons of centralization and decentralization. So should there be more levels with more power, or should there be fewer levels with more power, I guess? Should power be concentrated in kind of one central government, or should this be dispersed to a greater variety of governments? So arguments in favor of centralization. So first of all, some people can say that it does promote more democratic participation. It's closer to citizens, so they're going to have more accessibility to this democratic process. You can know who your city councilor is, know them personally, whereas it's very difficult to know, for example, the prime minister personally. So it can allow for a greater participation and greater number of people to participate in governments, and that can be positive for democracy. It can be more efficient to be centralized. Oh wait, we're doing centralization. I meant to do decentralization first. Okay, let's move back. So start again. So centralization, argument for centralization in terms of democracy, is that central government can have a stronger claim to legitimacy. There's generally tends to be higher turnout in elections that are at the central level and the national level, more media attention, and that can actually provide a greater sense of democracy. So the democracy argument, you're going to find out, actually works on both sides, because I almost missed doing one instead of the other. So there are arguments on both sides for which is more democratic. Efficiency issues. So centralization can help with efficiency. If you're providing public services at a smaller or more local level, it can become very inefficient, especially if it results in duplication. So sometimes there's high capital costs, and there are some services that really can only be provided at a central level. Things like national defense would be very difficult to do. Then again, I guess some states have their own national defense, but generally that's kind of one of the things you probably want to band together for. There's also things that you just can't do at a local level. Space research, for example. It's even hard to do that at a country level. Canada has to work with other countries, with other space agencies, in order to get people up into space. So that's an example of an international or confederation where Canada is involved in space research, not even at the national level. They need to be involved in the international level in order to be involved in space research. The next pro of centralization, it can help improve equality by allowing a central government to redistribute some of the resources. So we see that in Canada with transfer payments. Is one way. It's not really redistributing because, it's based on taxes already provided to the national government. But anyway, regardless, it's one way to ensure common standards across an entire country is if you have a centralized government that's going to ensure that everybody gets funded in the same sort of way, whether or not they have the tax base to support that. So that everybody's getting the same quality of healthcare, whether they live in a very rural, poor community or if they're living in a rich city. Obviously, in reality, that doesn't always happen, but at least in the ideal, centralization can allow for equality across the country. Protection of the minorities. So in decentralized systems, it's possible that local majorities can oppress minorities. For example, in the United States, certain rights of racial minorities had to be granted and upheld by the federal government because states were unwilling to do so. And so in this case, sometimes having a clear central government can help uphold the rights of certain minority groups. we talked a little bit earlier about how federalism can maybe actually contribute to the disintegration of the state. So if centralization is present, that it can help create some sort of a cohesive national identity, and that's the next point there. A large amount of decentralization can actually lead parts of the country to say, hey, actually we're able to do this on our own. You see Basque separatism, or Catalonia, or Scottish nationalism, or Quebec even, where provinces or states are saying, hey, well, we seem to be doing okay, like let's just break off. And so centralization can help, or greater centralization within a central government can help calm that down. So now let's go over to the decentralization side of things. Pros of decentralization. So again, I said it allows people to participate in local government more. It's more accessible to people. So there are arguments on both sides regarding the democracy aspect. There's also arguments on both sides for efficiency. So if decisions are being made by people at the central level, sometimes you can end up with a lot of corruption. If people are super removed from the implementation of decisions, if they don't really know about the knowledge of what these decisions are going to affect or what the implications are going to be, it can be just too rigid and unresponsive to local needs, and can really also lead to corruption. And so maybe it's better to have local people deciding what they want for local government. Again, adaptation to local circumstances, so local people know what they need. So for example, you wouldn't really want the federal government deciding what's going to be in every local library. That's a little strange. Instead, you get local libraries deciding what they're going to put in their library, or whether you should have more dog parks. A local government will know better, whether there's a demand for dog parks in their city. So it just kind of makes sense in some levels to decentralize, to allow you to adapt your decisions to what the local circumstances are. On the flip side of the protection of minorities, also local minorities can be given more freedom. So for example, they can have government in their own language according to their own customs. I like to give the example of devolution for Nunavut. So Canada created another territory, Nunavut, that was able to actually have their governance in a consensus manner that reflected their local customs. And that's a really good example where a local minority was able to achieve governance according to their local customs because of decentralization in Canada. Next, it can be a really good training ground for democracy. People often who become members of parliament will start off in local politics, and it allows a training ground for how to be involved in politics at a very local level, which can then transfer into other levels of government, and also provides an area to recruit for national politics. And then finally, as we saw with the Innisfil example, it can allow for experimentation and development. So the idea, even, for example, here in Kingston, we just in the last municipal election voted to have ranked ballots in the next municipal election, so an alternative vote system where ballots are ranked according to your preferences of candidates. That's something that probably, we saw wasn't really going to happen at the national level or even at the provincial level. Ontario tried it in 2007. BC just tried it and said no. Canada had that random debate about electoral reform that never amounted to anything. But local municipalities, so London, Ontario has done it, Kingston is doing it, is actually going to be experimenting with a different electoral system. And that wouldn't happen at a larger level. Instead, at this local decentralized level, we can have this experimentation. We often call provinces also in Canada as kind of policy labs, in the sense that you can try out different policies, see how they work. Then other provinces can say, hey, that works really well, and adopt it there. So those are some pros and cons of centralization versus decentralization, which is one of the big issues when we talk about multi-level governance, is how centralized do we want to be, how decentralized do we want to be. But as always, there's kind of no one solution that works for every country, that works for every area. And it's really going to depend on what kind of criteria and what's most important from these lists of centralization versus decentralization. So what's most important, in making those decisions according to that. Okay, so time to head over to the quiz. There'll be some questions there waiting for you, and we will chat more about this in class.